In this episode of the Encounter Report, a four-headed dragon has come to bring the ruckus. The heads include Axelrod, your humble narrator who did a second-plus playthrough, Grayson, the marathon runner who did a blind playthrough, Mr. JRPG, who did a not-blind playthrough, and Yulamasa, who did a blind playthrough. Everyone emulated the game with the exception of Mr. JRPG, who played the Wii U version. So with the brains of four streamers, Alchemy will be shaking in its boots. First up are battle types, and we get to immediately congratulate Grayson, Mr. JRPG, and Yulamasa for their pain and prestige of the 1000 Encounter Club membership. In addition to that, the encounter time percentage for everyone is pretty close to one another despite our varying total random encounters. Perhaps more interesting is the total time for random encounters. Mr. JRPG manages to come out ahead of Yulamasa despite having less encounters, while Grayson had significantly more time in the context of the Golden Sun franchise so far. For reference, the average time for encounters is fairly short, where I was at 17 seconds for average random encounter time, with Grayson at 15 seconds, Mr. JRPG at 17 seconds, and Yulamasa at 14 seconds. It's actually the lowest average random encounter time of all games logged for the Encounter Report up to this point, beating out Golden Sun 1 by a minimum of 5 average seconds. On the battle locations end of things, we can see the split of where the encounters took place and some curious comparisons. Both Yulamasa and Grayson did a blind playthrough, and that feels reflected in their encounter numbers. Both of them found themselves lacking direction and traveled to numerous locations looking for the next place to progress. Both Mr. JRPG and myself utilized a Jin guide, as well as a walkthrough guide to unstuck ourselves. This resulted in a lot less world map encounters and time spent in those encounters. And yet, Yulamasa has the most dungeon encounters, but the time spent in them is closer to me, who has the least amount of encounters of everyone. Then there is Grayson and Mr. JRPG, who have a similar dynamic in total dungeon encounters and encounter time. Quite strange. With combat types, we can see how each encounter concluded, and the stat that really catches my eye are deaths. Surprisingly, everyone has them, but they're primarily to bosses. My two deaths are to the Dullahan optional boss, Grayson's are to the Serpent before activating the lights, Poseidon prior to acquiring the Trident, and the Star Magician. Mr. JRPG died to Poseidon before acquiring the Trident and Dullahan, while Yulamasa died to Briggs and Alhafra, the Serpent before activating the lights, and the Doom Dragon. There's also the issue encounters, which are encounters that didn't come to a natural end. In every instance for all of us, we had restarted the game prior to those particular encounters concluding. Lastly, Yulamasa sports 217 encounters ran from, which completely destroys Grayson's measly 36 encounters. Part of the reason for this was Yulamasa utilizing a more custom Jin setup, which caused peers to lose access to the Avoid Synergy. Since he didn't know how to get it back, he opted to run when the option became advantageous. Grayson certainly used the Avoid spell the most though, so if it wasn't there, he'd potentially have another 200 or more random encounters ran from. There's also Mr. JRPG, who has the misfortune of having the highest run fail percentage, sitting at 53. Subtypes are next, and a similar issue occurred here alongside Golden Sun 1, in that the advantage and back attack numbers are more of a minimum number. Everyone loved mashing text, so it wasn't the easiest thing to catch them. It's also worth noting Grayson's grinding numbers. He was very determined to find all of the world map Jin and opted to grind in places he felt they were hiding. Rarely was he successful, but by the end, he was only missing one Jin, so it was effective. For notable locations, we'll be taking a look at world map encounters and the major dungeons of the game. With this, we can see that for each person, world map encounters on foot were not only a significant portion of encounters in the game as a whole, but also took up the majority of the world map encounter share in comparison to ocean encounters. While everyone spent their fair share of time on the boat, the synergy of Void, as well as the ability to fly, eliminated those entirely as the game progressed. For the elemental rocks, Ayers Rock was the first one that players needed to visit, but for Yulamasa, he actually missed the dungeon. Out of 33 encounter locations he visited, Ayers Rock was 22. In comparison, it was 8 out of 35 for myself, 9 out of 33 for Grayson, and 9 out of 34 for Mr. JRPG. In fact, it took him 633 encounters to finally reach the dungeon, which amounted to 4 hours, 30 minutes, and 24 seconds of fights. For Gaia Rock, Many people encountered issues with the Serpent boss fight, in that Krayson, Mr. JRPG, and Yulamasa fought the Serpent boss at least once without any lights present. However, once the lights were revealed, it was smooth sailing from there. When it came to the lighthouses, Jupiter's layout certainly threw everyone for a loop once or twice, but it was otherwise without many issues. For Mars Lighthouse, it resulted in the longest dungeon of the game. Everyone but Yulamasa left the dungeon once teleport was acquired to visit some old and new locations, but Krayson was also the only person to have a heavy usage of the avoid synergy while within the dungeon. When it came down to the Doom Dragon boss, our struggles were varied depending on how many cruel ruins were cast. In this instance, Krayson certainly received the most, but everyone overcame the boss with 1 or 2 attempts. Party composition is going to cycle by, and everyone kept their party mostly the same as the starting party. Yulamasa and myself didn't substitute any party members for any reasonable length of time, and for Krayson and Mr. JRPG, Isaac replaced Sheba. It's also interesting to compare when we get access to the second party to how many encounters were left in that playthrough. I sat at 25% encounters remaining, Krayson was at 17%, Mr. JRPG at 23%, and Yulamasa at 14%. Considering that these characters joined so late into the game, it doesn't seem all too odd that everyone was inclined to keep what they had. We also can't forget that they joined somewhere between 5 and 10 levels down from the main party as well. We've also got the level progression graph for each person. On the left, we have the levels, and on the bottom, many of the bosses in the game. Each boss takes up a rectangle in the graph, and within those rectangles, we have Felix's levels for when the boss was defeated. Here, we can see that despite the multiple routes, backtracking, and other barriers and stumbles we may have come across, our levels aren't too far off, and when they are corrected as the game progresses. Yulamasa's defeat of the Serpent comes in at encounter 875, which explains the large jump in levels he has from the Aqua Hydra to the Serpent. From there, everyone remains in a pretty similar ballpark, where everyone but Yulamasa gets a few jumps in levels for the Doom Dragon thanks to the optional bosses. Next up is the number of enemies per encounter, and it actually has a lot of similarities to Golden Sun 1. The biggest differences are a significant reduction in 4 and 5 enemy encounters, although those numbers were never high to begin with. The largest contribution is actually 3 enemy encounters, where we see about a 7 to 9% difference that is then added to the 2 enemy encounters. This would also be a good place to talk about Krayson's tactical approach to battles and how it has played out in his times. Excluding at most 30 encounters, not counting bosses, he would have all characters attack the same target, regardless of how many hits it would take to defeat them. This would cause added turns in encounters, since attacks do not automatically transfer to available targets when the enemy is killed. One would think this would significantly slow down encounters, but Krayson actually leads in average time in several areas, and at worst is competitive. Granted, he was utilizing a turbo function on his controller, so his inputs were faster. Still, it's fascinating to see that time-wise, it wasn't as detrimental as it seemed. And to wrap everything up, here's the final combined stats. With such large departures in VOD time, it actually surprises me how much encounter time has actually built up over the course of the game. On top of that, our average encounter time is fairly close together, and our encounter percent remains an interesting metric as well. With access to a void, one is capable of a large amount of exploration without the worry of encounters clogging up the journey, which is shown by Krayson's playthrough, whereas Yulamasa used it extremely sparingly and his numbers show for it. Then there's Mr. JRPG and myself, who were able to skip some of the frustration by having some amount of direction. In my case, I effectively always went to the correct location, while in Mr. JRPG's case, if he got lost, he would course correct, and our total encounter numbers certainly reflect that. And that's the Golden Sun The Lost Age Encounter Report. I hope you visit everyone's channels and social media to praise them for all this wonderful data. With another report done, I think we can all agree that the reveal synergy was a mistake. Thanks for watching, appreciate it, see you on the next video.